Hello everyone, welcome to episode 8 of this playlist where we are talking about writing unit tests and integration tests for React applications. So the topic of this episode is testing validation. So more often than not, when you have a form, you want to validate the user input. For example, you want to disable the submit button if the data is not valid, or you want to show error messages if, for example, validation fails. You can come up with different validation rules. For example, you can make all of your fields, input fields required. You can, for example, set a limit on the number of characters for first name or last name. So there are all sorts of validation rules that you can define. In this video, what I am going to do is to add some validation to our employee form component, and then I am going to write some tests for that validation. So I have my note here for episode number 8. As you can see, I have my application. This is the application that we completed writing at the end of the previous episode number 7. So I am going to create another branch. So I'm going to say episode number 8. And then we are going to implement whatever it is that we want to implement on this branch. So first, as I told you, we are going to update employee form. Employee form actually is used when you want to enter the data of a new employee and you want to create that employee, right? So right now, if I take a look at the employee form, this is what we have for employee form. So we have no validation whatsoever inside of this component. We are basically creating local states for name, role, department, and then we are determining whether we are adding a new employee or editing an existing one. And then we have this function that handles the submit, whether we are updating a new employee or adding a new one. But in this new version, we want to create some validation. So for example, take a look here. This is a local state called errors, right? And we are going to create an object like this. So name, role, and department are of type string. And then if you take a look here, this is the validate function, right? So basically we are going to check the values for name, role, and department. And if, for example, the name is empty, we are going to come up with this string that says name is required. And take a look at this type that we have here. So take a look at this new errors. We have created this, right? And then for each field of the employee type, we are going to check the value, so name, department, role, to see if they actually contain any characters. If they don't contain any characters, we are going to add something to that new errors type for the department, for the name, and for the role. And then of course we are going to set the errors state that we declared here, right? This is the errors state, and here we are going to clear the state on this use effect hook. And then on the handle submit, this is the code that we have for handle submit. We are going to call that validate function, and if it returns false, we are going to return. Take a look at this. This is the validate function that we are going to use for validation, and then we are going to return true or false based on the based on this condition, whether we have any errors inside of the new errors object or not. So if there is at least one error, we are going to return false. Otherwise, we are going to return true. So if it returns false, right, and we negate it, if the negation of validate, which is, for example, false, if there is any validation error, this evaluates to true, then we are going to return from this handle submit. And then inside of the template for this component, for example, take a look at the input. For the input, we are going to render out this. So errors.name, if there is an error associated with the name field of, for example, of an employee, we are going to return this div. We are going to show the message in red in a div, right? So that kind of prints out the validation error that we have. The same thing applies for role as well as the department. And then the other parts, for example, this button is going to be disabled if we have an error inside of that errors object. So this is the new version of the employee form component enhanced with validation rules. And right now we want to update the implementation of this employee form component with this new version. So if I take you to this piece of code, right now this is the version of employee form. I'm going to remove this, but no worries. Of course, you can find this on branch 7, I'm sorry. And now I am going to write this new version. So again, we are going to import state and effect. We are going to import employee type, and then we are going to create the props. The props has not changed. The component itself has changed. So right now in the component, we will have states for name, role, and department, and then we will have a state for the potential errors as well, for the name property, the role, and the department. And then inside of the use effect hook, we are going to check whether we are updating an existing employee or adding a new one as before. And then we are setting the errors to an empty object. Then the validate function, which checks the values for the properties name, department, and role. If they are empty, we're going to put that string, name is required, role is required, department is required, to that object, to that new errors object. Then we're going to set the state, returning that object keys. In the handle submit, first we are going to check whether the form is valid or not. If the form is not valid, we're going to return. Otherwise, we're going to take in that employee, either edit or update an existing employee again as before. And then we are going to set the local states as well as the errors object. And finally, for the template, for each input, we are going to create a potential div based on whether we have an error associated with that input field or not, both for name, role, and the department. Now this component, this new version of the component, has validation built in, and that means we can create tests for this validation logic, which is something that we are going to do shortly. So this is the button, update button, and now we are going to export the component. Something that I need to do is that we want to import this type. So type from employee. I am going to snooze the code completions for now. So this is the new version, right? Now let's go back to the note and see the test in action. We are going to test this validation behavior now. So the validation behavior is not that difficult. For example, check out this test. It says shows error message if fields are empty and form is submitted. So we are going to create the mock. I need to refactor this because we're not using jest in this case, we're using Vite. I'm going to refactor this, by the way. And then we are going to click on that add employee button, right? We are rendering the component as before, and we are going to expect that these strings are in the component. Why? Because we haven't added any values for those input fields. So that is one thing that we need to, do or test. The other one, does not call on add if validation fails. So again, we have the component, we have, these values for the department and the role, but we do not have any values for name. So that means if we try to click that add employee button, we expect that that click doesn't go through. So it says the unadd mock have been called never, right? So that basically means that if the name is not valid, even if you try to click that add employee button on your component, that unadd function, which is coming as a prop, will never be called. The next one, calls unadd when form is valid. So if you put values for name, right, department and role, and then you click that add employee button, it needs to be called once. These are the three tests that we need to write for testing the validation. So now let's continue writing the code. Inside of the test file that we have for employee form, there are different tests. For example, we are testing whether we get empty fields when we're not editing, right? These are the tests that we already talked about in the previous episode. We're testing whether we get the form when, with values of that employee, first name, name, department, and role when we are editing, and so on. So I'm going to get rid of this code altogether, and I'm going to write the new version of this test file. So we are testing the validation, right? We need to import the employee form and the employee type, and we are going to use Vite to mock the props of the component. So we are going to mock on add and on cancel. Before each test, we are going to reset our mocks. The first one, renders form with empty fields when not editing, as before. So when not editing an employee, we expect name, role, and department to be empty. Renders form with values when editing. When we do have an employee inside of editing employee prop, we expect those values, name, department, role, to be inside of the component. Calls on add with updated employee on submit. So we are going to check whether when we submit the component, we are going to call the unadd with the employee we have been updating. And then the uncancel to see whether it is going to be called when we click uncancel the button, the cancel button, I mean. Now about the validation. So first, again, inside of this describe block, we're going to mark on add and on cancel. Before each test, we are going to reset our mocks. The first test shows error message if fields are empty and form is submitted. So if the form is empty and we click on that add employee, these three messages are going to be inside of the component. The next test, the unadd function should not be called if there is a validation error. So if, for example, we add an employee who doesn't have a name, but for example has a role as well as a department, because there is a validation error because name is required. Even if we try to click on add, we are going to verify that that function has never been called. The last one, on add, is going to be called when the form is valid. So employee form with a very valid, component, employee who has name, role, and department. And when we click on that button, we expect that onAdd function to be called exactly once. That's it. So right now we have two describe blocks, right? The first describe block is what we already had, for the employee form. And the second one, this one, is for testing the validations. And we also talked about the validation, scenarios that we are going to test. Now I am going to run, the application. So let me get inside the folder and then npx. I'm going to run the tests, by the way, not the application. Let's see if our tests pass. These are the test files. Yes, we have 4 test files and 10 tests. All of them are passing. So what we did in this video was that we added validation to our employee form component. Right now, not only the component is enhanced with validation whenever a user wants to enter the details of a new employee and add that employee, but also we are, testing that validation logic as well. But we're not done yet. I'm going to wrap up this video here, and I invite you to keep watching the next episodes as well. If you are enjoying watching these videos, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the videos a thumbs up, a like, and also share it with a friend or someone who is learning React. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.